Welcome to the Sci-Fi Sci, a podcast about Black science fiction, fantasy, and staying on the same page in this marriage. I'm one of your incredible co-hosts, Amber Wallen.
I'm Ben.
Hi, Ben. Can you believe, Ben? We are in week 25, and this week we sat down to read 9 Bar Blues by Sheree Renee Thomas, and we're about to get into it. 25 weeks, Ben. The podcast is still popping. Ain't nobody been murdered yet. It's a good year. It's a good year. Why don't you talk a little bit about why we chose to read this book?
So Sheree Renee Thomas.
Yeah, that is her name.
That is her name. She wrote an anthology called Dark Matter, which was one of the first anthologies that said, hey, Black science fiction has something unique to say. And it was never supposed to be like the definitive part of Black science fiction, but she's sort of a god when it comes to anthology and helping other writers like get it done, especially when it comes to like Black science fiction and fantasy.
So Dark Matter is a collection of short stories.
Yeah,
but she wrote all of them?
Yeah, but all...
Or she compiled this?
She compiled them, and she got writers, and I think she was the first one to introduce W.E.B. Du Bois as a science fiction writer.
Oh. So that's what initially put... Like, when did you read Dark Matter?
I read Dark Matter when I started dealing with my racism.
Which was when?
I would say when I first moved to Chicago, I started working on the south side, North Lawndale, at a school. And there were just cultural things that I were really confused about. For example, it was at a Christian school. So at one point, there were some kids having this discussion. And I said something stupid.
Some black children?
Black children.
Having a discussion amongst themselves.
I was a lunch aide, and they were talking about, I don't know, I think I probably interrupted their conversation.
Right.
I probably butted in on their conversation. They were like 6th graders. And
still, a black space that you interrupted.
I did. And they were talking about, fighting, and I said something about turning the other cheek. And they're like, what does that mean? And I was like, in the Bible, because it was a Christian school, they had chapel. And one of the kids who had a good relationship with, because I ran after school, and I'd like watch kids play basketball with them. It was a really great experience. But he's like, listen, Mr. Wallen, this is the hood. Someone hits you, you don't turn the other cheek. Once you go down, they don't stop hitting you. They just keep hitting you.
Listen. And what did your ass say to that?
I didn't say anything to that. Anyway, I think Dark Matter was one of those books at that time where I was like, I need to read more Black authors. I had been reading science fiction and fantasy, and all I really know about Black science fiction was Samuel L. Delaney and Octavia Butler. So that's when I really started. This was maybe, 8 years ago now, discovering, Sheree Renee Thomas and Nnedi Okorafor and Nalo Hopkinson. I started reading all their works and sort of expanding my horizon. So yeah, I would say that was sort of my initial experience with her. But enough about me. This is a short story collection or a short story cycle. And I was like, a short story cycle, sort of like an anthology series. And I, since you watch like 8 hours of television every day, can you just sort of explain maybe what's like the benefit of having short stories or an anthology series instead of, a episodic, overarching plot type of thing? What do you think about that?
I mean, you can sort of watch each piece of the puzzle for what it is. There's a level of like overthinking that doesn't have to happen. Like when you watch a series where each episode is connected, you have to be like, oh, let me go back. What did I miss? I might have missed a really big piece to this puzzle. Whereas, when we watch Bob's Burgers, it's like, yeah, we know the family, but you can watch all these episodes standalone. Right. And I can enjoy them and just not get into, like, overthinking.
Yeah, I think there's this difference, though, between an anthology series, which would have completely new different characters, and then there's your overarching narrative, something like Star Trek Discovery, right, which has, a plot for the whole season. And then there's something more of like every single episode has the same characters, but it's different. That would be something like Bob's Burgers. Yeah. Oh yeah, the anthology series would be like Black Mirror. So what does Black Mirror or shows like that, like how would they bring something different or more unique? What do you think? Because you're the TV expert.
I am. Well, sadly, sometimes it's just like a shorter attention span, or it's like, if I didn't like an episode of Black Mirror, it was that episode of Black Mirror. I'm willing to give the next one with a new team of writers and stuff like that a chance. As opposed to like, oh, well, this show doesn't work for me.
Interesting.
Like, I was watching freaking Sharp Objects on HBO. It's going slow as hell. And people are like, but there's this huge twist at the end, but I'm not invested in the story anymore to go to the end. Because I see that the pacing of this whole show is like very slow and drawn out and not a lot happening. Whereas if that was an anthology series or a short story cycle, I could be like, okay, well, let me just like, that was that episode that was slow, but maybe this next one is completely different, refreshing new take on everything. So let's do something new.
I've been wanting to ask you though, because you also know a lot about rap.
Oh, who, me?
Yeah.
Why would you assume that I know a lot about rap?
I don't know.
I don't listen to any rap, really. So what would be the...
Well, Sheree Renee Thomas mentioned this short story cycle more as a mixtape. She described it as
I love
a mixtape.
that.
Or I think her editor described it as a mixtape. And I was like, oh, that rings really true. But I always like forget, what's the difference between a mixtape, album...
That's a good point.
Well, I know what a single is.
I feel like...
Singles
because this is why some people have... It's like why Chance the Rapper couldn't win anything for acid rap because it was a mixtape versus like Coloring Book was an album. So I don't really actually know, but I think an album has to be sold to the public for consumption, whereas a mixtape can be just like put online or something. There's something that's like a monetary thing. Like you have to sell it in a certain way for it to be considered an album.
Yeah, but then there's also this structural element where mixtape can have like a hodgepodge of different things.
Yeah.
But then also have this overarching theme. So it's both a capitalistic phrase, but also there's a whole thematic structure difference between an album and a mixtape. By the way, I didn't know that Chance the Rapper could not win anything for acid rap. And I just want to know that I had asked you about rap and you got offensive. But you knew that. You knew that. I didn't know that.
You know what? Let's talk about 9-bar blues before I just press pause on this whole podcast.
You do know more about rap than me. Because you're black, and rap is more of a part of black culture.
Yeah, I would say that. That's fair.
I can name all the white rappers. It's just
funny to... I mean, there's only about 5 of them.
I can name them all.
Name 3 white rappers.
Mac Miller, Eminem, Post Malone. He's more like R&B though, right?
Post Malone? I would say he's a rapper.
And then Machine Gun Kelly.
Not the full name.
Machine
Gun Kelly.
I know more for him for his acting. Anyway, let's move on to the actual short story cycle.
Because it was just like a beautiful drive, a magical drive through Memphis, and I really appreciate it, you know, for my southern reasons.
Y'all need to
you say y'all book. Now after reading this book.
I did. I picked up so many I discovered the blues, as you were saying.
Oh my gosh, y'all. We were going to a friend's house for just like margarita night, and Ben, after reading this, had, discovered like, oh, the blues exist. So he had just been playing like B.B. King and Buddy Guy on like Alexa level 10 sound.
I think you were trying to take a nap.
I was trying to take a nap.
Before we went.
And I'm hearing, my baby broke up with me. She stole my car. You're a dirty rat. And Ben's just in the shower just like...
Well, no, it's I smell a rat.
I smell a rat. You know what I'm saying, Ben.
Yeah, boy, yeah. I think I smell a rat in my house.
Well, the audience might not know.
It's just annoying that you decided to discover the blues when I was trying to take a nap and when we were about to go out.
So, interestingly enough, that's completely false. I did not discover the blues. I rediscovered them. Well, I told you. So, I grew up homeschooled.
Okay, Christopher Columbus.
I grew up... What?
discovered America. It's like, okay,
Oh, yeah,
sure,
yeah.
sure you did.
That's really funny.
Go ahead, Chris. Chris, tell the story. Tell the story about how the blues...
I was homeschooled, and I remember loving Led Zeppelin and Jimi Hendrix, but my dad grew up listening to those. He was a pastor, so he said I couldn't listen to those. So I had found myself on some weird website about like great guitar players, and that led me to like B.B. King and Buddy Guy. So I went to the library
as a child,
and you could get, CD-ROM. So the blues was safe, right? They didn't swear. They talked about like sadness and stuff, but my parents probably couldn't even understand what they were saying. Yeah. But I remember listening to the, B.B. King and Buddy Guy, and we'll get more into this, but that sort of led to me learning about a story, because I also discovered it was Robert Johnson as well, who was basically one of the first people to, create albums on the blues. And I went to Chicago in high school with like a Christian college trip. And on that trip, I got into like a pretty big discussion with one of the other students on there, because he said like Robert Johnson had traded his soul to the devil to like learn the blues, which is sort of a plot point in one of the stories of 9 Bar Blues.
So this kid wasn't wrong, but you wasn't trying to hear that.
Well, I didn't, because at that time I still believed in the devil, and I didn't want to think that I was like listening to the devil's music, right? And I was like, no, the blues is about sadness and dealing with slavery, and like we got into this whole we're dealing with at this point like sharecropping, or that Jim Crow.
I just love the visual of you being homeschooled, arguing with another student who was homeschooled, or was this a public school setting?
It was a Christian school.
Yeah, I just love like 2 white Christian boys arguing about the blues on a school bus trip to Chicago.
Yeah,
that's just a pretty funny. That's a pretty funny image for me.
Yeah.
Did you win the argument, Ben?
I don't. You don't. No one wins in those kinds of arguments.
So no, is what I'm hearing.
Well, yeah, sure. No, I did not. Well, I do want to talk about the cover of this, because sort of like the first impression. First of all, we loved it, but it's such a beautiful book. But I think, Amber, you sort of had this habit of fucking up our books. Like the last book we read, you got like coffee stains on it, and then you were eating hot chips for this book, and I saw some hot chip stains. So I don't know if you'd like to...
Well, this book is a love letter to Memphis and the blues and
hot chips,
and black
apparently.
girls. So if there's a hot chip smudge on one of the pages, that means I was like in it, eating some just like comfort food, because I was feeling comfortable and at home. It felt so, I'm not from Memphis, I'm from Georgia, but I just felt at home. And what do I do when I'm comfortable at home? I eat hot chips sometimes.
And smear them all over the page. There's literally like red markings on the page.
There's one page with a little smear. You'll be okay. That's what books are for.
It's disgusting.
Books are to be worn and felt and used. Like you want that imprint. You want to leave that, because that's how you read books. You read them upside down. You read them while you're eating. You read them while you're doing your coffee.
So it's like
every book is like a whole experience.
Okay.
That's what books are for.
All right, let's go into the first impression. You keep on mentioning Memphis, and in this book, Memphis is a big part of it. And I remember leaving this book being like, oh, Memphis is one of the characters. And then I read an interview from Sheree, and she's like, oh, yeah, Memphis is a character in this book, for sure. So talk to us about, like, how did you feel about Memphis after reading this book?
I mean, I felt excited and to want to go one day. As you know, we've been watching Buried by the Bernards on Netflix, which if you're not watching this show, you got to watch it. I know if you're listening to this show, you might not be invested in reality TV, but it's about this, like, Black family that runs a funeral home, a funeral parlor in Memphis, and they're hilarious, and all of their, turn of phrases are just like just remind me of home so much. And
it's
and
peppered
book,
with, it's seasoned with regionalisms.
It's seasoned, if you will.
With regionalisms.
With regionalisms. And this book is the exact same way. So I am excited to go to Memphis with you one day. I know that we're going to go to
Nashville.
You know, we're going to go to Nashville. I knew where we were going, but I didn't want you to get in trouble with your job. That's why I paused.
Well, I'm going to get vaccinated.
Right. Well, okay. Well, we're going to go to Nashville. I'm actually just I'm not editing that out.
Yeah, don't edit it.
Well, we're going to go to Nashville soon, and it really just made me happy because when we talk about travel, we glorify like traveling abroad and going to the West
like
Coast.
Tokyo or like...
Yes.
Yeah.
Ben has been wanting to go to Tokyo, you know, ever since I met him. And we will do that one day, but it's also really nice to go to just like a very like an American city rich with music and food and culture. And we overlook those southern cities sometimes, you know, because of the racism and the guns and the Bibles.
I really like that you put Bibles in that list.
Got your Bible, got your gun. That's the Southern way, baby.
All right, so basically, listeners, before they go to Memphis, they should read 9 Bar Blues and watch Buried with the Bernards. Right?
Yes,
Those are your two
of
criteria.
Course, because it was that magical realism. Like the book wasn't. So the backdrop of the book was Memphis and the blues. So this whole book was like a sensory experience in a way, which is what I really enjoyed because I could sort of smell what was happening. I could hear what was happening. I could see it for myself. And so I'm curious, like, you know, you're from upstate New York. Like, was this sort of like a 5 sensory experience for you or where you're like, I cannot quite visualize like this part of the book?
Oh, for sure. So there's one story in the book in which this sort of immortal being is, I guess, one of the muses who's brought music over from Africa into America. And there's a point where a character is describing African instruments and the difficulty in which to play this African inspirational music using like a box of wood and catgut. And for me, my violin strings are made out of catgut. I was like,
God, I did not know
yeah,
that.
so most strings are made out of catgut. So there are these little parts where if you play strings made out like a guitar string or certain strings that are not made out of catgut, there's a completely different feel. The strings on your fingers.
The guts of cats.
Yeah, so like catgut strings are the best.
Oh my gosh! So as a musician, you were able to tap in.
It was so. I was like, I wonder if Sheree like plays an instrument or just did her research.
She certainly has an intimate knowledge of musicality and you were saying something about how and she said in the book as well, but like how the blues is played on like a different fret or something. Describe this for people who have no musical background, like because I am
exactly. So there's this whole on a guitar you have frets, and if you play a note, you put your finger in between 2 frets, and no matter where you put your finger in between those 2 frets, you play the same note. And so if you move your hand up, you know, to the next fret, you play the next note. Well, what the blues is known for doing is that when you bend the guitar string, you're playing these notes, right, that are in between the frets. And that is why specifically it's not this like whole pure type of notes. Like if you play on a piano, you press the note and bang, there it is. You know, you can't play notes in between the keys, but on a guitar you can by bending the string. And that is why a lot of people thought that the blues was like inspired by the devil, because you weren't playing like the natural sounding
it's
notes.
like a purgatory situation.
Yeah,
with the instrument.
Yeah. So
that's awesome.
And there's a whole line into this about about that and how that idea is actually a pretty racist idea. It was helpful, I think, to sell albums, to be like, hey, this is music inspired by the devil, right? Anything that's inspired by the devil, or you can use as a marketing tool. But at one point, a character says, I think, the reason they did that to Robert Johnson, that he sold his soul to the devil, was because they didn't want to recognize that this man just studied the shit out of the guitar, which I thought was like really, really fascinating. But again, these are like little Easter eggs that I think if someone are like, even minimal music theory, they'll sort of pick up, and which was sort of, one of the big part of that. Let's actually, that's one of the big themes, is this power of music and this mystical power of music. And I know, Amber, whether it's 5 o'clock in the morning or 10 o'clock at night, you are, kneeling at the altar of music. And what I mean by that, you can explain.
Ben is trying to, in his shady way, say that I be singing my ass off, like, all the time. And
you don't sing, you sort of like croon.
What is that supposed to mean?
Croon means that you sing, someone can sing Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, but you croon, which is like you embody the music. Like,
I completely belt out and do choreo and am singing it from just like every fiber of my being. I'll give you that.
Which there's this character in the book, Animus, who is sort of like that. Reminded me a little bit of you. And
in the book, Animus is a DJ.
Yeah.
So it's this
But the way he feels music, I think, is very similar to the way you feel music.
Oh, for sure.
Sorry, yeah, go.
No, I'm just saying Animus is in the, there are so many characters in this book because it's a short story cycle, so we can't go into all of them. But Animus is one that really stuck out to me because he's this like DJ of mostly house music and different sounds that he has collected, but he's immortal and his partner is immortal.
Well, his partner is like this goddess of music that brought over the inspiration of the blues. But the blues could at one point there's a line that the blues could only be risen from the Delta. Like blues is a very Southern Black American like experience.
Yes.
But it has its roots in Africa. And so this goddess, I think the main plot of this point is that this goddess is looking for this new kind of note, and she gives this power to this DJ, helps him become immortal, and then they sort of travel around the world for this hidden new music. I think they found deep in an ocean. It's like very mystical and magical.
It's so fascinating.
But I didn't mean to interrupt you, but Animus is sort of like DJing, the way he fuses things to create house music. But yeah, go for it.
For sure. Which music for me does that because I'm pretty sure the first music that I ever heard was like gospel music. And, we can all say how we feel about different religions and if you're non-denominational, but like there's something about gospel music that just like takes over and you are just like, for me, it's like yoga. It's like, this is a full holistic, like breath, mind, body experience. And because music was introduced to me in that way, I can't just sing, The Little Mermaid, how she sings it. Well, she kind of does let it embody her, but like I sing The Little Mermaid like, a 50-year-old, like divorced house mother of 4 because it just like I'm feeling every single pain in every part of this story. And even as someone who I wouldn't call myself a big singer, but I do think I have a really beautiful voice. Like
as someone who lives with you, you're a big singer. But yeah, keep going.
Said like you mean like I meant like a professional singer.
Right, you're not a professional, but you're a big singer for sure.
Yes, what. You want to say something? Because you're looking like
I already said what I had to say.
Okay, well, I'm not somebody who is a professional singer, but I deeply understand harmonies, and I can tell when I am vocally off key and things like that. And so I remember I took this music class. I've taken a couple of voice lessons, but when you go audition for things, you have to choose to sing 16 to 32 bars. Like, that's the standard. And I remember struggling to be like, but I'm feeling this whole song. Like, how can I just choose this? And my music teacher was like, choose the part of the song that tells a story. Like, that can tell the most complete story. So that doesn't have to be the intro or the outro, but sometimes that story exists sort of like in the bridge or the hook of the song. And she was just like, just choose the part of the story where when you sing this part, they hear every word of it for the first time and they can feel the story. So even if it's like Les Mis or something, like obviously I am not,
that sounds like the blues.
I'm not in the French Revolution and who is now like been forced into prostitution or sex work or anything like that. But I can sing a part of I Dreamed a Dream, which I wouldn't do because that's just like, you're not going to get that part. But I can sing a part of that sort of connects my experience and my past pain and trauma to the words of that song. Does that make sense?
It does. And the very structure of this book is very similar to that because you are looking, there are interconnected stories. Some characters show up in the same stories or are referenced, and the places are definitely referenced the same. And so you're getting like this incomplete bar of music, right? And so I think you have to, you could read the individual, you can read the individual stories, but I think reading the whole thing, you get sort of the whole music, but you can read the individual stories and feel all the individual stories. It's actually a really, really nice comparison. I don't know if have you ever read Jazz by Toni Morrison?
I have not. Okay. It's on our to-do.
I think you need to, that was one of the first, I think that was the first Toni Morrison book I read. And she uses music as the inspiration for that book. So in this way, it reminds me of that, 9-bar blues reminds me of that type of structure as well. I want to talk a little bit about dance. And there's a scene in here where a character is like dancing in the mirror as like a little kid. And you're a choreograph. Like that's what you do.
I'm a what?
You're a choreographer.
Choreographer?
Choreographer. I don't even know how to say it.
I wouldn't call myself a choreographer, but I can pick up like 8 counts. Like in the same way that like I wouldn't call myself, I'm not a professional dancer, but I could be taught a basic 8 count and keep it.
Reading that scene made me think, I'm like, I wonder, was this Amber as a kid, like dancing?
Oh, absolutely. We did choreo, we did singing, and this whole book was just like, yes, I remember those like hand games and the jump roping and things like that.
It's like a love letter to like little black girls. Like you saw yourself very much.
For sure. And every story wasn't about that. I think she so beautifully did a great job of balancing, like, because when you talk about and think about all the things that were in the book, it sounds like it would be a little bit of an overwhelming experience, but it wasn't. Like some stories were longer than others, but there were even some parts about like climate change and fracking in there, and that still paired well with like little black girls doing hula hoop and double dutch that I found really fascinating. But what else were you going to say about dance?
Well, yeah, so this story I'm referencing, the narrative is that there's this white pop artist who sort of looks like, I'm assuming in my head, looks like Neo from the Matrix after he gets out of the Matrix. So she has shaved head, and she has like all these hookups that you hook up into her, and the way they do concerts in this series is that you have someone dance for you, and so she has this black woman dance for her and do all her choreo, but this white woman gets all the recognition. And this is like a way distant future in which this is how entertainment is done. You have like the pop artist, but then you have like the black backup dancers, and I was like, we're not too far from that.
We are literally there. Like that's literally TikTok.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think this way it's like there's an actual like hookup in which there's like I don't know. There's some sort of high tech part of this story. I
was all into that.
I think it's like that story is the last dance. The dragon can't dance. The dragon can't dance. Which is, the dragon is the white lady and is sort of consuming this black dancer, this black artist. It's a great, great story. But the thing that I want to bring up is, remember that, I think you brought this up to me, that people were stealing dances in Fortnite. Remember that whole thing?
Yeah, well, it's so interesting because dance and physical movement is not protected in the way that stories and lyrics, like if I went and wrote my own book called 9 Bar Blues and stole her stories, I would be sued, you know. But dance isn't like that. Like, I can make up a full choreographed dance, post it on TikTok, and someone else can just take it and it's theirs now. So it's those little physical and those mannerisms and even like physical comedy things you could do. I could easily go see somebody else do that in an improv show, and I'm just like, hey, what's happening? That's my bit. But there's no way to sort of take that. There are some things that you can do that like are signature yours, like Michael Jackson is signature moonwalk. And so, but he reached a level of fame where nobody could take that from him. But I'm sure, you know, I don't know, but Michael Jackson could have easily taken the moonwalk from somebody else, and it's his now.
How do you feel about white people doing step? As someone who's an AKA, was on the step team in college. Because remember they had that step, what it was, a step sisters?
Step sisters or something. You know, it's one of those things where like, it's so clear that it's not there. like many things. It's hard to gatekeep dance moves. It just is. So when you see a white person doing steps, it's like, oh, that's good, but or cool, nice nod. But as a culture, I think people love a transformation. Like, that's, you know, going back to like the Black British actor, right? Like, people love, oh my God, you're British, but you can transform your voice into an American.
They really can't. Their accents are bad.
Not all of them, but I'm just saying, or like a Nicole Kidman. I won't even just say Black British actors, but like people love, like, oh my God, Nicole Kidman, she's Australian, but she can transform.
She is? Wow.
You didn't know that?
I'm joking. Yeah.
But I'm just
She married a country singer too, so that might, I don't know. Anyway, besides the point.
I say all this to say people love a transformation. So it's when I see white girls doing steps, like, oh, that's fun. Like, we you know, some of my friends did a step for our wedding. Like, it was like, what was it about? But when I see, which I rarely have seen, when I see white women doing a step and being praised and people are on the floor saying like, I've never seen anything like this ever. That's when it's like, what? Really? Like, there are these two girls, they're makeup artists. I think they are mixed race. And they braid their hair in these like twists. And Glamour magazine was like, oh my God, look at these twins with this new cutting edge fashion. And so obviously everybody in the Black community was like, what do you mean new? Like, we've been doing this for years, but people like a transformation. So Glamour magazine was like, we've never seen anything like this. Like, these girls look and pass as white, but they have like these twists. Like, did y'all invent this? So it's annoying when people are praised for like this, you know, stolen transformation that they're having when Black people do those things every day. It's like that their mediocrity is being praised when we do that every day.
I see what you mean. And I think that's why The Dragon Can't Dance, that story is more compelling, because the Black dancer in this story has no recognition. I mean, sure, like, she's getting paid, but the white pop star is the one who's getting all the recognition.
Right.
And that's sort of where the problem comes down to. And
it does. Like, if Justin Bieber was Black, I don't think he would be as famous as he is. You know what I'm saying? But since we love, like, oh, this white boy can sing, but he also has swag and he can dance and he can play guitar. It's like, I know hella Black men that can play guitar.
Donald Glover would disagree with you, though.
Donald Glover would disagree with me?
Yeah.
He did like a spoof on that in Atlanta.
Yeah, exactly. And Justin Bieber was just as famous.
He was not.
Oh, he wasn't?
He wasn't being followed by paparazzi.
Oh,
he was playing basketball at like the local court.
Oh, was that the whole joke?
I think it was.
Oh, I missed it. It went over my head.
Yeah, I think Black Justin Bieber was to show, like, if a Black person did this, they would be like a D-list celebrity at best.
I thought it was
it's
showing how absurd what Justin Bieber actually does and how he acts. I didn't know it was a commentary on his fame.
I think it was, but I mean, we both haven't seen it in so long because it came out we saw it around the time it came out. But I think, I think it's
right,
both.
actually.
It's like the absurdity of it and the normalcy of it.
Yeah.
But it's like the Kardashians. It's like, I'm sorry, you're literally selling like big butts. We've been doing big butts since the beginning of time. But you're, blackfishing. So it's black. The blackfishing is more praised than the actual blackness, which is what this story so clearly emphasized.
I actually want to go back. You mentioned fracking at one point, and you could only get this in like Southern fantasy horror, but that story ends. Spoil. I know we'll spoil.
Can I say
spoil
something
alerts,
really quickly about that?
Alerts, everything. Yeah, go for it.
When I think about fracking, I don't think about the South. Of course, I mean, maybe I'm being super naive, but when I think about fracking, I think about like wide open spaces of land where this is happening. So Wyoming, Montana, like I know that that's not true, but I just...
Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I need to do more research about fracking.
Well, I think this story, there's a factory that ends up poisoning the water, sort of like Flint, Michigan,
Yes.
and really destroying this entire community. But the way it ends is like there are these giant cicadas, monstrous giant cicadas that come out and like destroy the factory at the end. And I love that because you don't get that type of fantasy unless you're writing in a certain environment where cicadas is just part of the culture, right? Like
I love that biblical imagery as well.
Oh yeah, about
the locusts.
Exactly. It has such a southern feel, and there's so many parts of this collection that feels so southern. So, what I wanted to ask you, what were some other things that you read? You're like, oh, that my grandma says that, or things that sort of struck to you as being like very southern, whether it be like language or whether it be something like cicadas being out.
Yeah, oh my God, the freaking
well.
cicadas. Well, Ben, I'll share this with the listeners. There was a point where Ben and I were not struggling to read the book because it's hard, but we only have one copy of the book, so we try to maximize like, okay, when you're at work, I'm gonna read, and then when you get home, it's all yours. And
sometimes when it's all mine, it's just slathered in hot chips. But yeah.
Of course. And so one night when Ben was cleaning up, I decided to just read it out loud. I was like, let me just read it out loud so that we can both sort of be on the same page about it. We weren't in the same place, but we were reading it out loud. So I will ask you, what are some things you noticed when I was reading it out loud to you?
There's the twang to the entire rhythm, like the language, like the way you were reading it. I could listen to you read it all day. And there's these like snapbacks that are really like that really stuck out to me. And something as us being amateur foodies, but walnuts and
like
pecans are a big part, and they mention that a lot in this book. But at one point, I think we were making pecan pie, and you call your grandma, and your grandma was like, "Are you pregnant? Only a pregnant woman would want to make pecan pie." And that, for me, that very mythology or that very language felt for me so southern. Like the idea that pecan pie is this symbol or this index of pregnancy or like rebirth felt so like mystical, magical for me.
Or also just like and I'm not sure, you were raised in a Christian home, so a lot of things that happen in the South can sort of become a Jesus mystical world. For example, growing up, every time it rained and was sun shining at the same time, hands down, when you're in the South, you're like, oh, the devil's beating his wife today. That's what that meant. It meant that
what the fuck?
You've never heard that?
No.
So whenever it's raining and sun shining outside, that means the devil's beating his wife.
Shut up.
Yeah.
I believe you, and that for me sounds so southern.
Yeah, like if my mom woke up and asked my dad, was like, look outside the window, what's the weather looking like? And my dad answered, well, the devil's beating his wife today. That implied that it was like a little bit of rain, a little bit of sunshine. Things like that. Or, and this actually is a medical thing, but you know, in the South you have porches with rocking chairs on them sometimes. So another weather thing is like my grandma could tell if it was going to rain based on how her knee was feeling if she was on the front porch. Because medically speaking, I think there is some sort of like dampness in the air that happens with your knee. But it'll just, everything is that, right? Everything is like some sort of like, I feel it in my bones, or y'all going to hell in a handbasket. Everything was always about a turn of phrase for the most part.
Exactly. So
as opposed to like facts. Sometimes.
No, that's a really good point. This idea of turning the phrase. At one point in the story, in the short story 13-Year Long Song, there's this great example of what you're talking about, this turn of phrase, where this character Rachel is talking to her father, Doc, and he's getting all worked up. So Rachel says to him, "Daddy, don't start up again. Last time you make a ruckus, your pressure went up." And his response was, "My pressure didn't go up. My patience just low." Like that turn of phrase for me felt so Southern. And the book is just peppered, seasoned with all of them. Southern seasoned.
Spiced, yes.
And I can absolutely hear that type of phrase being said when we go back to Georgia or whatever. That
because it's the shortening of it. Because in the South, there's a general there are so many things that don't need to be said, so you can easily tailor your language based on like, I don't have to say my blood pressure. It's like my pressure. Like you, and I'm sure like every region has some things. It's like I can say it in as few words as possible.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I don't know what to do with that. I don't know if is it partly because of there's almost this monolithic culture that exists within the South, which sounds like the South is, I think there's a stereotype that the South is not as diverse. And when you don't have a lot of diversity, people are able to immediately fill in the blanks, right? For example, if you go to church, you can use certain phrases that everyone will understand you in church simply because you have that shared language. And I'm wondering if the South, because it is less populated, I don't know. I
think the South is diverse, but we definitely have a shared language but the regionalisms make it diverse. Like obviously somebody from Memphis isn't going to sound like somebody from the Bayou in New Orleans. So there are different things like regionally, but there is a shared understanding about a lot of things, I would say. And then lastly, something that just made my heart sing, like I said, were all of the hand games. There was a scene with these little girls who had gone missing, sadly, but then they were stuck in this like time loop on this playground. And so they just had to play hula hoop and do double dutch and hand games all day. So I could easily read like, Miss Mary, Matt, all dressed in black, black, black. Like I could hear those songs as a child. You know some hand games, right? I'm going to teach you a hand game. I'm going to post on Patreon me teaching Ben, like...
It's going to look really sloppy.
Like shame, or like tweedly,
yeah.
All those. So those just felt like a big hug and a homecoming.
I wonder how much of those are regionalisms or just a social gendered construct where you as a young girl would be taught this and I would not, or I wonder whether regionalisms. So I'm just curious like why I don't know that and those things and you do. So that's something that I want to explore more. Is it because you grew up in the South? Is it because I'm white, or is it because you grew up as a girl, I grew up as a boy? So I think, or it could be sort of a mixture of all those things. I do want to talk about that story, Teddy Bump, though, because these girls don't go missing. They're murdered. And, it made me think of this article I'd read a while ago in which Black women oftentimes go missing. Yeah. No one thinks about them. And this story sort of has this element of like mystical and the beauty of music and all this wonderfulness, but then there's some really disturbing stories. And in this story, all these little girls, it's referenced, one of them was shot by a stray bullet, one of them was like stuffed into a freezer in a hotel, like some really disturbing elements to that. And so this book delves the whole emotional spectrum, you know, moving from like horror, fantasy, you know, hard, you know, science fiction, hard science fiction to an extent. But yeah, I really appreciated that.
It's interesting because there are full like crime junkie podcasts dedicated to like what happened to Relisha Rudd and what happened to Kanika Jenkins. So I think that I want to believe that Sheree Renee Thomas was trying to sort of address this culture of like what happens when this little black girl goes missing, what happens to the community, what happens in the press, because the reality, this comedian made this joke one time, I can't remember which comedian, but he was doing the stand-up special and he was doing some crowd work and he sees this white woman in the audience. He's like, oh, you a pretty white woman. You one of those white women that if you went missing, you would be all over the news, something like that. You know, the audience laughs and stuff, and she probably has like an annoyed face. But I remember thinking in that moment, like, I cannot really think about, like, when white women go missing, it is, I cannot tell you how many things that I have watched, that I have reshared, that I have partaken in of you know, what happened to John Benet Ramsey, what happened to Madeleine McCain, what happened to Natalie Wood. Like, there are full documentaries and think pieces and research teams and GoFundMes out there. But when these little black girls go missing, it's just not the same energy, and it's really sad. And I think she was reminding us of that fundamental truth.
Yeah, and there's actually a couple stories that deal with that. Another story that deals with that is the parts that make us monsters. And there's this really like haunting line talking about the Atlantic slave trade, where Sheree Renee Thomas writes, "We lay in the noise and the filth with the mothers and the sisters and the daughters, listening to their dirge song of shrieks, moans the twisting of tongues, the deaths of worlds yet born." And this whole idea of all the women who just were disappeared and lost. And yeah, there's I think 3 stories that reference the disappearance of women. One specifically referencing Sandra Bland, and then...
Well, there were stories in the book about people who had been wrongfully murdered by the police. And then there were stories that were about missing children, missing black women, missing black children, which is really interesting because, like, even when all of those women went missing and women and girls went missing in Boko Haram, it was like, Obama, hello, like, like, yeah, this isn't America, but like 100+ girls just went missing, black girls, and I just know that if 100 white children went missing, something would be done.
Yeah, there is an element where like people are like wrongfully killed by the police, but in that story, one of the characters' sister by the end of the story like just disappears.
Yes.
Right, and so there's this vanishing element, which is I think very real. Like
sort of like the first story as well with the 2 sisters. Like she's sort of like swallowed by the sea. Sorry for all the spoilers. Oh, you got to read this book because it's mythical. It's magical realism, but it addresses so many things that wouldn't be that, you know, like with the fracking. Like it's people do fracking, and maybe a wave of locusts and cicadas don't come, but giant cicadas
yes, crawl out of the ground and can like stomp on buildings.
But it is that like heightened reality that sends people into shock, sadly, more than the like, no, black girls do just vanish. That like that's not even that.
They're not in some purgatory somewhere, right? Like,
exactly.
Yeah, it's so. This is I think the power of science fiction, fantasy, horror, is that you're able to write about very real experiences through a fantastical lens, which for me makes it even more hyper realistic because I'm like, oh, this has a fantasy element. Oh, but this is actually real. You know, I think of that movie, what is it, District 9, I don't know if you've ever seen it, but these aliens come to Earth in South Africa, and they're sort of sectioned in these like sort of shacks and sort of isolated. And I remember watching that and being like, oh no, there are people, humans living like this today, right? And so you're able to write about immigration through this science fictional lens. So like, hey, you felt bad about these aliens. Hey, they're actually humans, people who share your very DNA, who are living like this. And I think that's sort of the greatest power of this genre. I don't know. Let's go to size. I mean, I didn't really have too many size about this.
I agree. You know what would have been cool? I mean, and maybe this is just me being campy. So the cover of the book, which we sort of didn't describe, but it does have some of a little element of every part of the book. It's like a cicada, and then there's this like moon and alien. It's just really a nice pattern.
That's the Memphis City
style. And then the center of the book is sort of like what would be the center of a record. Like with the little hole where you drop the record and everything. What would have been cool, maybe, if there were a couple of more musical cartoons in the story or musical drawings because there were a couple of times where Sheree Renee Thomas came back to certain characters. What would have been maybe just like chef's kiss on those parts is if like, what was it called music? It's like a coda or something. Like if there was just a little something there that if you knew music
to give you the hint that this character,
that we're coming back to something or there were some stories that were longer and shorter, right? So maybe there could have been like half notes versus like a full measure or just a little something that would have been a nice little nod to like, you musicians out there, this is what's happening, because it read like a music sheet in a lot of ways. Like you came back to certain things, not so much like a chorus, but you were like, oh, I remember Aunt Dissy from an earlier chapter. I don't know, like the book was perfect, so I'm just really just grasping at straws right now, but I think that would have been a little bit cool.
Yeah, I think you had also mentioned that if we had sort of a specific map, because yeah, and this is the thing, right? It's like if you watch all of Martin Scorsese's movies, you get Martin Scorsese's New York, right? You get his experience of New York. It's not actual New York City. You go to New York City, you're going to have your own experience. But if you watch all his movies, you get a very specific kind of New York. And that's how I felt like reading this, is I was getting a very specific kind of Memphis, right? If we go to Memphis, we're going to have a very different experience of Memphis. But for me, this almost created this alternate dimension of Memphis. Yeah. And I think it would have been cool if there was like some sort of family, maybe a family tree, because there's some elements.
Or it's like, this is Scallywags Way and this is east of the Mississippi or whatever the things were.
But according to, Sheree Renee Thomas, like her perception of that, I think would have been really, really fun. I think my sense is that there are more stories that are going to be written in this world, and
I love it. I'm really taking a deeper look at the cover now, and I'm seeing for the first time like mermaids and a dragon.
Yeah, there's a mermaid story. Yep.
And I like it was just enough, and it would have been cool to have a couple more of these elements in the book, some of those artistic elements. But stylistically, you got to read this book. It's powerful.
Yeah, I'm all for it.
Well, I think it's time for you to warp up the show.
In conclusion, go ahead, buy 9 Bar Blues. It is published by Third Man Books, so it's not one of those 3 mega publishing houses. I think they're based in Nashville, Tennessee, so support smaller publishing houses.
Thanks, man. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Sci-Fi Side. Next week, we are watching Michael Schultz's 1985 cult classic, The Last Dragon. Get ready for some kung fu and black magic, y'all, because this is actually my first time watching this movie, and we cannot wait. So be sure to watch The Last Dragon by Michael Schultz, not to be confused with Ray and The Last Dragon, and we will see y'all next week for the show. Bye, y'all.